Hey everyone, it's Andrew from Equilibrium Systems. I was prototyping the other day and wanted to try to figure out if I could reproduce a video scrubbing type solution where you can kind of scrub a video timeline back and forth, change the speed, all that kind of stuff using timeline that's built into Unity right away. I wanted something kind of similar to what you see in the Batman Arkham Origins game with the crime scene investigations, or in a game like Tacoma where you can kind of scrub back and forth in real time while it's playing this sort of like scripted motion that you see. And I thought timeline like that Unity already has would be perfect. I tried just doing some simple stuff like setting the time manually, and that didn't seem to work. Then I came across a post that I'll share with you in a minute, but I'll show you basically what I want to do. So this is a scene I set up. I set these buttons up, start a timeline and stop a timeline. Then you can start it again from the beginning. This slider down here is not labeled, but this is the speed of the timeline as it's playing. So I can increase it, I can have it go backwards, I can slow it right down. This is basically the playback rate. This down here is the current time of the timeline. So here is 0, starting it, and I can use this to scrub right through. Now you'll notice the music is not being affected, but that's something we'll get to in just a second. So I found a post basically about this exact same thing on Unity's forums from May 2019 or so, and there was a response from someone at Unity, Sean T underscore Unity, who I personally know. I used to work with him, and I know that he is now the team lead on the timeline team. So I know this is definitely the right solution to my problem. And the post basically says that having the animations play in reverse is not built into timeline, mainly because it doesn't support things like audio. And for obvious reasons, I guess they probably don't want to play music backwards. You can accomplish it via script by setting the playable director play mode to manual, setting the time manually by going backwards in delta time, essentially, and then by calling this defer to evaluate. But he says this won't allow markers or audio to work. So what I had to do to set this up is basically create two timelines, which I'll quickly show you. This one has just the motion for the cubes and the sphere and this capsule. And you can see here I've set the playback mode to manual. I've set it to loop. Initial time, current time, that's all the same. So I'm not going to go through setting up a timeline. Basically, I'll open this up. These are just locations in the scene that have the positions I want to go to. And this basically, these tween clips basically do that for you. Now, there is one package I had to download called Unity Playables, which has this transform tween clip added. So that's sort of like an important feature, and that basically just moves an object along whatever destination you want over a period of time. And you can specify that in here, see this duration, etc. So I'm not going to go over that any further than that. And then I have another one here that basically just plays the audio track, and that plays separately. So I'm going to turn off the canvas, and we'll start fresh. We'll create a fresh new canvas. And I'll show you, I better stop this. I'll show you what I did to get this going. So we'll go to the scene, we'll go to 2D view, zoom out. This is going to be our new canvas. UI, I'm just going to place a button down, Text Mesh Pro button. Basically, this will be our start button. So I'll just quickly have this, label this start. Change the name of this to be start. And I'm not going to worry about this too much. Whoops. I'm just going to move this manually into position. I'm not going to worry about the anchors and all that stuff. I'll make the button a little bigger. And so this one is pretty straightforward. Basically, when you click it, we're going to drag in our timeline manager, And in here, you'll see the playable director, and you can just hit play. Super straightforward. We could do the same thing with the audio track. If you want to have an audio track, same thing, just tell it to play. And then likewise with the stop button, same idea. Playable director is part of the timeline, which I'll show you in a second. Playable director, timeline. Okay, so timeline here. This is the playable director that you need in order to play the timeline. So that's the easy part out of the way. The next part is where it starts to get a little more complicated. Well, let's just test that to make sure that's actually working first of all. So start. And it looks like the music is playing, but what happened here? Oh, it's set to manual. Right. I gotta actually I have to actually add the scripts to. So if I were to set this to game clock, let's just do that quickly. I'll show you. So if this was like a normal timeline, you just want to play forwards, then this will work. So, and you can see here it's going to play, and then it'll just loop, and then I can stop it. Okay, so let's set that back to manual. And let's add the next things we're going to have. I'm not going to add the labels that I had in the previous one. Those are pretty straightforward. They're basically just you put a label above this, and then when this changes, so you could say like on value change, you drag in the label here, and then I added a script that'll basically just take the text or take the value from the slider and make it into text and put it into the label. And then you would just say like on value change, you put it here, and then you just say like update text. I'm not going to bother with that. So this will be the speed slider, and then we'll create another one of these, and we'll call this one the time slider. Timeline. Okay, so this one, the first thing we want to do is we want to mess with the minimum value. So this is going to be the speed, the playback speed. So let's just go with, before I had -2 and 2 as our playback speeds. The default value is 1. Basically, that means full speed. And then we'll want to look into creating a script that will actually adjust the timeline when we go to build this. So let's just add a script. New script, and we'll call it, I called it update timeline speed before, so let's just call it change timeline speed. So we're going to include the Unity Engine.playables. This is going to have the playable director that we want to have access to. So this is where we're going to drag our timeline in so we know what to start. And then we also want to have access to our speed. And we'll set that 1 to 1 currently. So we won't need anything in the start. We don't need to really initialize anything. And then we'll do it the update in just a second, but essentially we want to add a public function that will set the timeline speed over some value. And then every time we call this, which is essentially when the slider changes, we want to change the value we're storing. So then in the update, the first thing we want to do is make sure that the playable director, playable graph, which is basically the asset that's in it, is valid. And if the playable director, playable graph dot get time update mode. So this is where we choose if we want the game time or manual. So we want to say basically if it's not manual, we're going to set it to manual just to ensure that it is the way we want it. So now we are in full control of this timeline. And like we saw before, it won't play if we don't do anything else. So we want to adjust the time on each frame, which is what we're doing. So in this one, we want to, so in the forum post that I put up earlier, basically I said you would want to do minus delta time, but that's basically if you just want a direct, like basically like -1 speed. So since we want to control the speed, we're going to use just our current speed, and the current speed will be either over 0 or under 0. And basically that'll achieve the same thing. So then this will handle everything pretty good, but there's a little error handling we can do here that I found out about. So basically, even though it's set to loop, I'll go back to Unity. Even though the timeline is set to loop, it actually won't handle this automatically. So let me just go to this quickly, timeline manager. So it's set to loop here in the wrap mode. Now, when it's in manual, it doesn't seem to recognize this. You have to do this all yourself. So let's go back. Let's add a little error handling for the wrapping. So if the playable director.time is less than 0, basically we need to tell it to go to the end. So loop. So if we're looping, if we actually want to loop, we want to take the time that we currently have. So this is the extra time, kind of tail on the end. So this will take care of the time that's we've run past 0, and we'll just add it. We'll take it off of the total duration to ensure that we have a nice smooth transition, especially if we're looping with something that we want it to be a smooth loop. And then otherwise, basically we just want to hold the time at 0 if we're not looping, instead of running very far into the negatives. The other situation we want to handle is if we go over the time, so greater than the duration. And then if, same like we did before, if the extrapolation mode equals loop, then we want to take the extra time that this time is after the duration. Duration is kind of how long the total track is. So in our case, I made it 10 seconds long. And then we want to set the time to be that extra time, because now we're going from the very beginning and coming in a little bit more. And then else if we want to check, this is not really for this thing, but in the hold, basically it just wants to keep it at the very end of the timeline track. So this is just ensuring that it stops at the actual end and doesn't go over time. And then this, I'll just set it back to 0 in the other case. And then we want to make sure that we call this mplayable director.evaluate to make sure that all the values get updated properly. Now in the forum post, it talked about using deferred evaluate, but that function actually only works in the editor. So I believe that's for like if you're editing in not in play mode, you'll want to use that. So at runtime, which is what I want, you have to call evaluate. So let's stick with that for now. Let's let it compile. Then we'll go into the speed slider and we'll drag in the timeline we want to control. Current speed is 1. So then on value change for this, we want to call the set time speed. Oh, not that one. That is the static one. We want to set the dynamic one, which is at the top. So this will take the actual value that the slider is at. So let's just test that out to make sure that's working. So we'll start the timeline playing. Now we should be able to see this running faster, slower, backwards. It's not very easy to see with how I have that, but you can see I can scrub it backwards and forwards now with the speed. So that's just controlling the speed. So now we'll do the actual time scrubbing. So that's the speed of the video that's playing back, or the timeline. This one has basically the same idea. So we'll add a new script. We'll call it change timeline time. This is essentially the exact same. We're not going to adjust any of the values here. Those don't really matter on this one. We want it to start as 0, and we're going to dynamically change the max value. We're going to do actually another script called, we'll just call it setup scrub values. So this is going to basically set the max value for the slider based on the length of the timeline that, or I guess the timeline asset that is set in the timeline manager. So we'll set this one up first. So we're going to be using the Unity engine, if I can spell, .ui, because we're going to need access to the slider. Unity engine .playables again, so that we have access to the script, or the playable director, I mean. So I'm just going to fill those in. And then on this one, we don't need the update. We just need the start function. And so I'm not going to put any error checking. I'm just going to assume we've set both of those. But basically what we want to do is we want to set the max value of the slider to be the playable director. Playable director. Oh, that's wrong. Playable behavior. Playable director. Dot duration. So that is the total length. And then essentially we want to set the current slider value to 0. So basically we're starting at the beginning of the timeline, and we have now set the slider to be the maximum value to be the total length of the playable director. So that's all we should need for that one. So then let's go back in and we'll set up the timeline time one. So let's drag that in. Was it compile a bit? Timeline manager. Okay, so that's going to set up this slider based on whatever's in this timeline manager's asset. Now let's set up the change the time. So when we're scrubbing, this is going to handle actually changing the value in the timeline. Okay, so we'll need access to, we don't need access to the slider, but we will need access to the playable director. And we don't need start or update. We're just going to need our own function, a public function that we're going to use to call on the change. We'll just call this set timeline time. And so we want to make sure that the timeline is actually playing. Otherwise, we don't really need to update it. So we'll check if it's valid. And if it's playing. Okay, and then we'll also make sure. So we can set the time, and then we can evaluate it. So then if if playing is false, so this is actually a little error case I came across, where if you weren't playing and you started scrubbing, it would start it from playing. It would start it to play. And I didn't want that. So this is just a little error case. You don't have to have this if that doesn't suit your needs. But anyways, there it is for you. So let's get this to compile, and we'll test it out, make sure everything works, and hopefully it does. Okay, now the timeline manager's in there. So on value change, we want to call this setup, and we want to call set, oops, wrong one, set timeline time. So this will take the time of this value here and set it. So let's give this a test. So we're starting it. Still adjust the speed. Now you notice the slider isn't updating, but we can scrub it based on where we want. Now I realize that is because I do have another script. I'll show you it briefly, but basically this updates that slider label, but I also update the slider value on the update. So I basically take the playable director that's on it, I get the time, change it to the text. That's displaying it. Now if I want to update the slider value, which I don't want to do in every case, but I do for the scrub, I will basically take the current director time and throw it into the slider. And that will keep that bar updating like you saw in my original video. And that's basically it. It's pretty straightforward. It was actually a lot easier than I thought it was going to be, and hopefully this helps you guys out. See you next time.